So thank you for joining today's session, everybody. Our session today is Introduction to Replication Sets. Just wanted to make everybody aware that this session is being recorded. And a quick reminder before we get started, please use the chat feature to ask any questions throughout the presentation, and we will be sure to address them. A copy of the presentation and a link to the recording will be sent to all registrants. If you are not a registrant and you would like a copy, please send me an email and I will include you on that distribution. I'll drop my email into the chat, but it is molly.velasco@nordicglobal.com. So next slide, just quick reminder that Bales is now Nordic. As many of you know, Nordic Consulting acquired Bales a little over 2 years ago. Just a reminder that we continue to do the great Infor ERP work that we've always been known for, same familiar faces, just operating under the Nordic brand moving forward. So after that quick reminder, I will turn it over to Robert and Jared, who are our presenters today.
Hey, Molly. My name's Robert Schmidt. Jared Brock is with me today. We are practice leaders on the Technology ERP Services team. Sorry, I got the participants involved. Just a quick overview, just a quick disclaimer based off the information that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to look at, in essence, what are replication sets, just some real quick, some high-level options and configurations. If you're looking for some more in-depth on that, we actually did a previous presentation, and it's out on our YouTube channel. And then we're going to look at, or in essence, creating your own and how that can be done, or talk about how that can be done. And then we're actually going to jump into a little bit of if I want my data to be able to go out into the data lake. So making the connection via Ion, and then how can I see that data out in the data lake? So what are replication sets? In essence, I just wanted to put this up here. Infor defines them as a landmark feature that enables you to copy selected data to several different targets and schedule updates through the replicated data based only on what data has changed. So we see replication sets used in quite a few different solutions and quite a few different areas. And some of the areas that we've seen this come across today are replicating data from Infor down across onto your own network. We have clients who have their own analytics. They have their own use of the data that out of the multi-tenant cloud out, and making sure that they're able to see this internally and be able to disseminate it, slice it, dice it, do whatever they want with it. Replication sets is a great way to be able to get that data from the multi-tenant cloud down. And it was initially designed in essence to be able to see as data has changed, but we do have the ability to see full sets of data. So it isn't just to see what has changed from the last time it ran. I can get the full spectrum of the data that I want, ad hoc if I just want it at this point or going forward. And in our cases, we have seen this sending to the multi-tenant cloud for burst, for data analysis and interfacing, and as well as seeing it come across. We've used this in essence to be able to send out to service definitions or IPAs, or just in essence to do some just full analysis on the data itself. So related to the replications themselves, Infor does deliver replications. They are initially set up in order to be sent to the data lake and utilize Ion, but you can set replications up to be sent out to an SFTP. And then you are allowed a few different options. Like I said before, they are in essence designed to give you change data. So as the data within the business classes change, we're going through business processes. When my replication set runs generally on a schedule, it has the last time that it ran, and it's going to look to identify what data has changed based on the definition of the business classes within the replication set and provide out that change data, or I can reset it and be able to pull and do full exports of the data within there. Keeping in mind, full exports can give you a lot of data. So I do have some of the abilities to look back into history and backfill based off of how much data I'm trying to pull if I'm pulling that much. And then Infor does deliver a set of replications both for the GHR side as well as the FSM side. And you can't edit, or you shouldn't edit, the existing replication set. If you want to make changes to a replication similar to a lot of our IPAs and those items, we're going to duplicate the replication set, and then we're going to make our changes to the duplicated rep set. One of the main reasons for that is Infor still does make changes to the replications. So if you were to edit the replication and put it into production, and Infor delivered a change to it, you're going to lose the edits that you made. So copying it and kind of creating your own gives you the ability to get the updates and the changes that have happened and not lose what you have going on in your production environment.
So, hey, everybody, this is Jared. So we're going to take a couple kind of audience questions that we had ahead of this presentation and kind of sprinkle them in throughout this. And the first one we've got is, and this, we hear this all the time, and I think this can be a little bit confusing with all of the different extraction tools that are now available in Infor. But the question usually goes something like this: when do I use replication sets versus file creation utility versus something in IPA or something in ION or maybe even an API? Those are all good ways to get data out of the modern Infor system, but they're all purpose-built for different use cases, right? And I try to think of them kind of along a spectrum from, maybe on one side of the spectrum is the most data possible, and the other side of the spectrum is super, super granular. And along the way, along that spectrum, I kind of see replication sets at that one end of the most data possible, and then maybe something like APIs on the other end of the most granular. So let's talk a little bit about why. So replication sets, and you can kind of infer this based on some of the use cases that Robert talked about just a little bit ago. The sort of the out-of-the-box destination for replication set data is to the data lake. And what's the data lake? It's a data warehouse. We're trying to capture and hold as much data as possible in there. And we're not trying to be very specific. We're not trying to filter too much stuff. We just want all the data we can in that data warehouse, right? And then downstream systems can pick and choose from that. And if you just think of even just that one use case, it's a really good example of why replication sets kind of are at that wide open end of the spectrum for just being really good at grabbing lots and lots and lots of data. And that's kind of how they're optimized from a development perspective too, right? It's probably the quickest way to grab all the data in your system. And I'm kind of air quotes around all, but lots and lots of data in your system, it's pretty quick, right? File creation utility is moving a little bit over in that spectrum because file creation utility gives us a lot of ability to be really a little bit more specific about the data we're looking for, and format that data in a really particular way and add very specific criteria to that data. Those are things we can do to some extent in replication sets, but file creation utility is really a lot more specific for making a particular type of file. And so I think of that as like maybe even an integration, right? If we're going to send a demographics file to a particular vendor, there's a good chance we can format that file right in the file creation utility and use that to generate that file. But that's pretty specific, right? That's a lot more granular than something like the replication set where we're just trying to sweep up all the data. And then if we went even farther, there's things like Infor process automation, there's things like ION data flows, there's things like APIs. Those all get even more granular, right? So that's kind of how we like to think of replication sets on that spectrum of here's all the tools to extract data. Where do these different things fit in for the particular use case I'm thinking of, right? Back to you, Robert.
Thanks, Jared. We wanted to call out some specific configurations that you want to make sure that are either set up within the environment. So on the multi-tenant cloud, some of these are going to be set up for you, and you're going to want to make sure that you go in and validate that you have some of these pieces. If you're starting to go in and play with replication sets or putting the replication sets to use within your integrations or data analysis. So on the administration console side, if you're going to be sending anything out to an FTP, more than like being an SFTP, you're going to want the directory host, and then of course you need a password related to that. And then general practice here would be that we want it to be FTP secure or SFTP related, sending that across, and then of course your username to be able to do that connection to the SFTP.
And Robert, a quick thing on that. So I think a lot of people looking at that configuration will recognize that FTP location, right? If you're in the multi-tenant world right now, you've got this FTP location. Infor provisions that for you. And that's the default destination for a lot of things in your system, and for good reason, right? But you could conceivably change that. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, and there are ways we can reroute replication set information to a different SFTP if we needed to, right? So just something to think about in the bigger picture.
Great point. And then you can set up more than one. You'll just need additional configuration parameters to be able to do that. But to date, most general practices to have it go to a single location and then take your file movements and those pieces from that location. And then on the administration console as well, so there are some configuration parameters. We have a screenshot here of a few of those to call out, and making sure that you're setting up the appropriate configuration parameters that match against, especially the FTP related replication sets that are going out. Chunk size is one where it's going to be breaking up your data set into different files based off of how much data that you're having there, how much is actually being included in there, in order to know that you're sending the appropriate amount of data to that secondary or destination related source. So we've talked about, in essence, what is a replication set. We wanted to kind of take a second here. This is an actual brand new creation, and this is a very small replication for presentation purposes here. So I created this replication. I gave it my own name. So it's the RS replication to Data Lake or to DL. You'll see, let me put my highlighter on or laser pointer here. So I have last replication at this point. I haven't created or I haven't ran the replication. I'm just creating it. When you come inside, once these are scheduled or once you run them, it'll hold that last date and time. This is the part that's being used in order to go back and look to see if there's data that's changed. If I reset my replication, that goes away. So it gets all brand new data in and of itself. I can maintain a history count here. So the last X number of times this ran. So if I want the last 10, if I want the last X number, that's where I'm going to set how many of that history count. You definitely want to be careful here, depending on the size of your replications, on how much history you want to maintain. And then if I want my replication data sets to be able to interact directly to an IPA, I have that ability via the service. So I can create a service definition, which allows me the ability to tie to my process definition or IPA flow. And then when my replication set finishes, it'll see that this service field is populated, and it will then kick off that service definition and then in turn go through and kick off the IPA. And you would need to handle that data set coming into your IPA and making sure that you're doing what you need to do with inside that. For our example today, we're actually going to be sending this, or it was looked at to send to the data lake, because we are getting multiple questions, quite a few questions today about what can I do to get my data into the data lake, and it's really not that intensive to be able to do it. So we created a small one here. We're using a JSON format. And then the key here is I want my schema output and my data output to both be IMS. This is kind of the key indicator here that is telling me that I want to be able to send this to the data lake itself. And then on the bottom here, this is where I'm going to add in my business classes. In my case today, I added in only one business class, but this is going to be where you're going to add in all of your business classes. Generally, my replications are going to have, 10, 15 plus business classes. It doesn't have to, but you're going to be pulling that data in from different places and making sure that you're able to match the data set that you want. I do want to call this out because I'm going to reference this a couple times for everyone to be able to see how this moves. My replication name here, so I defined this based off of putting my initials here. That way we can see how this kind of pushes through the system from the creation of the replication set all the way across to the data lake, and how I would be able to then see that in the data lake.
And Robert, could you go back to that previous slide for just a second? I want to something you just said. I want to kind of call out and underline. So the words here get a little bit confusing sometimes because we're talking about replication set, replication classes, business classes, the replicate name. And the way I would think about this is the replication set is the name of the activity in the Infor side of things. In other words, this replication set that Robert created contains these different classes and contains the definition of where that data is going to go. But when we go into a downstream system, let's say the data lake, we're not really going to see that replication set anymore because that set is an Infor concept and it stays in Infor. What we're going to see instead in something like the data lake is this replicate name. That's why the replicate name is important, because as Robert's going to show as we get a little farther down, once we're looking in the data lake, it's that name that's going to show up for all of the different classes that we've included in this replication set. So that was kind of a learning curve for me when I first hit replication sets and trying to wrap my head around where all this data is going and how I can kind of keep track of it. That's why the replicate name is really important. That's what's going to help you keep track of things when you are looking at the data downstream, and in particular, in the example we're going to talk about with the data lake. So just wanted to kind of hit back on that because I know that was something that I got stuck on for a while. So or anything to add on that, Robert?
No, I was gonna say I did as well. It was the same thing for me when I got into here trying to match and follow this through across. It's a valid point because I got caught there too, trying to connect the dots. Which is, here I want to help in this presentation wise to be able to call that out. And Jared, thank you for calling that back out.
Yeah.
And real quick before you guys move on, there is a question too. Which other export formats are available? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So the top ones are JSON, CSV, XML, and columnar. Those are the four main. Jared, I don't think there's anything else outside of that for exporting.
I don't think so either.
Out of replication set.
Yeah, I think those are the only three. And it's a good question, and we're talking a little bit about what maybe when you would choose different formats, and it's really kind of your use case, right? So in this case, we're sending to IMS, which means the data lake, and that's because Infor has configured the IMS channel here to go directly to the data lake, and that requires that it be JSON. We can't send a CSV file through Infor messaging service because it only understands JSON. So if we sent to CSV, if we had the export format set to CSV, but we sent it to IMS, nothing would happen. The system would get confused. But if we were sending this, let's say, to SQL Server, or somebody's going to take a PowerShell script that's going to ingest this data, well, maybe they would want that in CSV, right? Because maybe that's going to be an easier format. So it's all the same data. It's just what is your use case and what does your use case kind of require between those options. And I see another question kind of follow on that. What if you don't add a business class? Well, if you don't add a business class, your replication set has no data to replicate and nothing will happen. You might still be able to get it to trigger the service, but I actually don't think you can even run a replication set if there's nothing defined in it. I don't think the system will let you do that. Okay, let's, Robert, you want to move to the next slide and we'll talk really quick about that kind of audience question. So this is a really good question that used to be a really big struggle for clients and in legacy laws and in the new, multi-tenant, getting the audit logs, getting easy access to the audit logs. In multi-tenant, there's really powerful audit logging everywhere, which is great, but especially early on, it was a little bit tough to get at that in a way that was machine readable, meaning, something we could build integrations or reporting off of. Now it's much easier with replication sets because you've got this flag. Now this happens at each replication class definition. So you have to do this by business class, but you can go in there and you've got this flag for data to extract, and you can just choose audit log entries. Now you see a couple different options here too. The default's current data, but if you want to grab the audit log for that specific business class, and remember, audit logging happens at the business class level. So every individual business class has its own audits. You'll be able to define that here and build those into your replication sets. Just know if you choose audit log entry, you're not going to get the data. So you might need to have multiple replication class definitions if you're trying to get the data and the audit log. But it is possible now, and we're just starting to see clients kind of use this feature to stay on top of their audit logs in downstream systems. So it's really pretty cool.
Agreed. So kind of continuing this journey, we created a replication within Landmark. I have the payables invoice business class that I tied within the replication itself. And if you recall, I mentioned that it was the specific name. So here within IonDesk, my first spot I want to double check is that I have my object schema. And here's where I have my FSM_RS_payables invoice. So this was my replication that I ran. And when I ran it, it recognized the IMS and we generated an object schema within IonDesk. And this is the intermediary step getting us from Landmark over into the data lake. So I can now see my business class being an object within Ion in order to start tying those pieces together. And then from here, within IonDesk and my connect and connection points, I now want to, via my object schema, I want to then tie my document to a connection point, right? Because if I have a replication set, I'm sending the data, I want that object tied to some sort of object for it to be able to come across. And in our case, it ends up as a document and comes across as a bot or business object document. So I'm going to find my connection point. In this case, it was FSM. I then want to add my document because this is a new replication. So I want to add this within my connection point. And then once I'm in there, I'm going to choose my JSON. So this is my output type. And in my case, I just wanted to find mine. So I did my _RS here. And then here we reference back to here's my FSM underscore RS underscore payables invoice. This was my business class that I added to my replication set within Landmark. And once I've added that from my search, here I'm pulling the data from Landmark. So I want to send from the application. I want to come from Landmark in order for it to be able to go over into the data lake. Once you've added your document, you're going to want to make sure your receive or send is appropriately checked. And some of these could very well be both, but in my case, I want the data going from Landmark FSM over into the data lake. So it's coming from Landmark and going to the data lake itself. And here's my FSM underscore RS underscore payables input. That's my business class I originally added. So once I've connected it within my connection point, I've identified it that I want it sent from the application to go out. At that point, we need some sort of mechanism for it to go somewhere, and that's our data flows. So within my data flow, I want to make sure that I have my FSM application coming out and going over into the data lake. So this is coming from FSM and going into the data lake for it to be ingested within the data lake itself. And I want to make sure I add my documents to be able for it to be sent. So this is allowing my business object document to go from the FSM application. And when I run it, it's going to come across into Ion. Ion's going to recognize it, and it's going to say, I need to go to the data lake, and it's going to send me across to the data lake.
And I'll add one thing here, Robert. So something I would think about as people are looking at this, you might be thinking, well, doesn't some of this stuff work kind of out of the box already? Because don't replication sets feed the data lake and then feed my burst analytics pre-delivered dashboards? And if you have those, there is a lot of this stuff that probably is already configured, right? A lot of the people on the call probably already know that Infor delivers, and Robert mentioned this at the beginning too, real quick. Infor delivers a bunch of replication set definitions, and those are meant to provide data for downstream systems, specifically the burst pre-delivered analytics. So if you have those analytics dashboards, they are based on those delivered replication sets from Infor. And depending on when your implementation was and kind of what was in scope for your implementation, it's very likely that a lot of this stuff is already built, a lot of the moving pieces. But in Robert's example, we're making a new replication set with a new document name because he provided a new replicate name that's specific to that class he built. And so anything pre-delivered or anything kind of out of the box for those replication sets to flow into burst, it's not going to account for that new replication name because that's not going to be in the original definitions because we're creating something totally custom. So one way to look at some of this is what Robert's doing here is allowing us to kind of piggyback on top of some of the stuff that's probably already built for you to include this additional document that we're talking about here, right? And if you're going to go make a custom replication set, you might have dozens of documents that are new and that are custom, right? And you'd have to do this for all those. But that's kind of why we're going through these steps and why some of you, if you went and looked at your system right now, you'd see these data flows there already, and that's fine. And so your job wouldn't be to necessarily create a new data flow, but just to make sure that on any of these, you are including this new document name that's going to show up now in Ion. And then the only other thing I would add is, as we talk about stuff in Ion, don't think that Ion and replication sets are synonymous, right? Ion is a whole layer of your technology stack that handles all sorts of different things, primarily, handling the movement of, Robert mentioned the BODs, business object documents, and those go all over your system, not just for replication sets and not just for the data lake. So we're just borrowing kind of a really small piece of the Ion technology piece to move these BODs for our specific use case here where they need to go. But just keep in the back of your head that Ion has all kinds of other stuff beyond just the pieces that we've looked at here. And these pieces we've looked at aren't specific to the data lake or the replication sets. They're just features that we are using for the data lake and replication sets.
And you made a valid point here. I just want to take a quick step back. So we've kind of gone into this ion side, and we're looking at this object schema and the connection within the connection point. And obviously, for presentation purposes, I added one business class, right? It is not uncommon for you to have 10 plus business classes. So each of these pieces, so looking at the object schema, coming across into the connection point, you're going to be validating and adding each of those replicant name pieces, each of those objects into this. So obviously presentation wise, I only wanted one, but you would be validating that you have the 10, the 15, the how many ever business classes that you've added to that replication set across each of these steps. So I'm going to add, if I have 10 in my replication set, this step would include adding 10 document names within my replication and going into the connection point from the replication. And then here, it's the same thing. If I had 10 business classes that I added in my replication, I got 10 steps I want to make sure that I either set my receive or my send from application. In the scenario or the solution that we're talking about, most of all of these would be sent from application, but I would want to make sure all 10 of them are added, and I want to make sure all 10 are sent from application, and then make sure to do saves, please. And then lastly, coming back into there, same thing. I need to make sure that the system understands all 10 of those in our example are going to come across, because any of them that I don't add to the existing process are not going to come across to the data lake. They're going to run. The system's going to say, I don't know what to do with this, but I'm going to still complete, and you're not going to get the data coming over to the data lake. And then to come full circle to this, how do I get my data in the data lake? We're now in the data lake. We're in Data Fabric, Data Lake, and then Compass, which is how I query my data. We can now see, for the simplistic purposes, I have my object FSM_RS payables invoice. This is now a query I can run to pull data from my object that originally started from Landmark coming over into the data lake. And I can run my queries, I can make connections, I can do all those pieces I need to do, which we used to on-prem via like SQL. I can now go into Compass and do those pieces within the data lake.
And I think that's worth underlining. So Robert, when you talk about running a query, you're really talking about SQL. You're able to, in the Compass interface or engine, you're able to query with SQL anything that lives in the data lake. Compass kind of allows you to treat the data lake like a relational database. And Compass it's just kind of a web front end, but it lets you get to all that data in a really easy way if you know SQL. And if you don't know SQL, you can still do a lot of browsing of the objects that are in there, right? Because like in his example here, you can see, just as if you were in a database browser, like maybe SQL Server Management Studio or something like that, you're able to see, okay, here's this object, which we know is a database table. And here's the fields in the table and the data types and things like that. And if I wanted to, I could just run a quick select statement and see the data that's in there. Now there's a little icon here. It says JSON. It's a little bit misleading. That's not really a JSON object necessarily that we're looking at here and interacting with in Compass. But what that icon tells us is that's where that file comes from. It comes from, that table is populated by a JSON file. And the system knows that because in all the previous steps where we set up that document flow that Robert walked through, the system knows that the only way this FSM_RS_payables invoice table should be updated is via this data flow that contains JSON data, right? But there are other ways to get data into the data lake. That could be CSV, that could be other types of web calls that are interacting directly with the database. And we would see those differences reflected on that object thing. And then the only other thing I'd say in this example is look at the objects, the count there, 770. A lot of those are pre-delivered. So if you go back to what I talked about, and if you've got kind of maybe what I would call a typical multi-tenant implementation, where the moving pieces between the replication sets, the ion flows and connection points, and then maybe an endpoint like burst, if those things are set up, you will see here in Compass tons and tons of pre-delivered objects, because those are all driven by the replication sets that are set up, that are delivered by Infor. And we can add as much as we want on top of that. But again, just know there's a lot already here if you want to go out and look at examples and play around with running some SQL queries and things like that, right?
Jared, there was a question, would this work with Microsoft Power BI?
So technically, yes, because there are, if you think of the data lake as a data warehouse, and it is, and you think of the Compass layer as a way to interact with the data in there, there are third-party tools that via a JDBC driver connection can connect to Compass and run SQL queries. However, something like Power BI, really any reporting platform, they're going to want a lot of data, right? So the challenge there is to figure out how to efficiently replicate, and replicate is probably a bad word in the context of this presentation because I don't want to confuse people, but how do we copy out and extract that data from the data lake such that Power BI can read from it, right? We probably don't want Power BI to be making API calls, querying the payroll history table every time we run a payroll history report, right? Because that's way too much data, and an API call becomes an inefficient way to get at that. But there are other ways to get data out of the data lake, and there are other ways to populate Power BI with what's in the data lake. And so I do think this can work with Power BI. Data lake can be the source. There's just a couple other hooks you're going to want to put in there, but that's absolutely a possibility.
Excellent. Thank you. And then going over.
Oh yeah, and I even forgot that this was our last audience question, but that's a perfect segue, right? So, in this presentation, we've talked mostly about the data lake being the use case we want to examine for a replication set. But remember that that's not the only example. It's just one of the more complicated examples, and so why it's kind of worth digging into. Your replication set data can go to a lot of different places. The data lake is just one of them. But let's say that your data is in the data lake. Okay, now what do you want to do with it, right? The delivered use case is those burst analytic dashboards, right? There's a lot of you in multi-tenant probably have the HR talent analytics dashboard or the FSM analytics dashboard, and both of those can come pre-delivered from Infor, and they've got pre-delivered reports, and they run against those pre-delivered replication sets, right? And so that's the easiest use case because that's one that's basically out of the box. Now, you could do custom reporting in Burst, which would require that you make custom replication sets, just like Robert did with your specific additional replication classes that you're going to capture, because those pre-delivered replication sets don't capture everything in the database. They don't capture all business classes. They only capture what's necessary for the pre-delivered burst content. And that's not really clear when you're looking at the replication set definitions in Infor, but that's the purpose behind those. So if you wanted to do custom reporting in Burst and you knew how to do that, you would need to add some custom replication sets to get that data in there, but that's something you could do. Just like we were talking about with Power BI just now, there are other reporting tools that you can use a JDBC connection to access what's in the data lake. And you can pass SQL queries against what's in the data lake and pull data out that way. And you can replicate that. A lot of reporting platforms, like I said, it will not be very efficient necessarily to report off of the data lake live directly, but you can use the data lake as a source to populate those reporting tables that those reporting platforms would prefer to have the data in, right? So that's certainly an option. Another option is using API calls, not necessarily for reporting, but using API calls for other systems that want to reach in and grab some data really easily from the data lake. You might have some questions about efficiency or elegance, maybe, because remember, you can also expose API points directly in your multi-tenant environment. You can expose business classes to an API, and that data can be retrieved live from the live system. But there might be good reasons why you would rather do that against the data lake. And certainly if you're looking at pulling really big chunks of data, that's when the data lake becomes a better choice, because we're not slowing the production system down or putting undue strain on the production system with these really big queries, right? So the data lake does kind of open up all those additional options for us in ways that we can extract big chunks of data without pulling down the performance of the live production environment. And I think a question that kind of tacks into some of this is, how often can we refresh that data, right? So we've kind of seen this step, and we didn't really talk about scheduling, but I think most people who are already a little familiar with the replication sets know that in most cases, in most use cases, we're going to schedule these things, and maybe they're going to run every night, or they're going to run every week, or they can run whenever we want. So if it's a small enough set of data, we can run these things every hour. But the balance there is figuring out, what is my actual need? How real time do I really need this data that's in the data lake? And then how much data am I asking the system to replicate each time this thing runs? Even if it's only picking up changes, right? Because if we're picking up, something like an audit log, or we're picking up personnel history, or like, maybe PO history, or something where there maybe are going to be a lot of transactions in our system every day, that replication set might run for a little while. And if we start stacking those on top of each other, they'll step on each other before too long, right? So the system will let us run these things every 15 minutes, but that's probably not a good idea in a lot of cases, right? So I wouldn't, in most cases, recommend replicating any more than 2 or 3 times a day. Really, I think once a day we've seen that be the sweet spot for most of our clients and projects. But you can certainly be more aggressive. You just have to balance, what do you think that load is actually going to look like, and how long do you think that's really going to take to run? And I don't know, Robert, can you think of anything else? Is there anything I'm missing in terms of what you can do? Any other good use cases for data that's in the data lake, or even for replication sets, I guess?
I mean, not outside of what I mean, the solutions that we've provided here today are solutions that we've implemented with clients, making sure to be able to have data readily available, as well as fulfilling rights-related objects for implementations.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So any other questions? I know we've gotten a couple of really great questions. We had some prior to that we wanted to get incorporated here. Were there any other questions that anyone had from the participants? Okay. So we have coffee with the consultants. Feel free to reach out and provide us, with a question or an item, and that way we can get you in touch with one of our consultants to hopefully solve a pain point or a question that you have, for a complimentary 30-minute conversation. And so please reach out in order to be able. Looks like, Molly, I believe we have the nordic.com/contact to fill that out for being able to get that in place. And then we have a couple more informative Friday presentations coming up. On October 13th, we have a new tool for functional financial users, the Infor Report Designer. On October 20th, we have troubleshooting MSCM, printer and printer agent issues. And then on October 27th, we have continuous performance. And then plan ahead. So we have another after October series. In the next quarter, sessions will be kicking off around in February of 2024. And we're working on putting those items together. So we look forward to getting those out and working with you well for those. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
Robert, I'm sorry, jumping in. We did get an additional question in the chat there.
Oh,
For
audit. Yep, for audit log-based replications, do we need to create a separate replication set for each business class, or can multiple business classes from audit log be pulled into one replication? So I think this is really going to be, I mean, I hate to put it back this way, but this is going to be based on your business need. I could very well see a business need for only pulling audit log related information. But since this is business class specific, if you needed data pulled, current data pulled for the same business class, you'd have to add that business class twice.
But I do
within the
think
same replication.
I think
Go
if
ahead, Jared.
you wanted, if the use case here was we just want a replication set that is an audit log for a dozen different business classes we want to watch, you could have multiple replication class definitions in that one replication set that are all pointed to audit logs for those various business classes. So you could have multiple audit log business classes in one replication set. But to Robert's point, if you're trying to pull data, the actual data that's in the table, plus audit logs, those are going to be two separate replication class definitions to capture each one of those.
Alrighty.
Great. Well, thank you guys for a great presentation. Thanks everybody for joining us. I will send out a copy of the presentation and the recording within the next few days. So look for that in your inbox.
Sounds good. Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Molly.
Thanks everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
good weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.